my films, they're so objective that sometimes people are concerned that their faith is going to get beat up when they look at my films, because I do allow multiple viewpoints to be heard. But I think you're going to have people that are going to look at this. And like I said, I've got audiences that are broad from all different walks of life that are going to look at my films because they give all sorts of different viewpoints. But I also want you to know that I have something for people of faith that are interested in seeing a pattern of evidence that actually is going to help them see that there's a historical credibility to the Torah and to the Bible.
Shalom, this is Nehemia Gordon, and welcome to Hebrew Voices. I'm excited to be here today with investigative filmmaker Tim Mahoney, who's working on a series of movies. 3 of them have already come out. Actually, one is coming out next week, February 18th, 2020, for a one-night viewing. Shalom, Tim Mahoney.
Hey, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Tell us about your Patterns of Evidence series. You know, before we started, I called you up before I'd even seen the movie, and I said, what are you trying to prove in the movie? And you said something I really appreciated. It was just the 2 of us alone on the phone. You could have said anything, but it really showed me, at least, what is the man behind the scenes. You said, I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm presenting evidence to people. I'm presenting both sides. In this case, I think you're presenting 4 different sides and letting people decide for themselves. I really appreciate that you're doing that. Tell us a little bit about this series that you're doing and the movie that's coming out February 18th.
Yes. Well, I think the title itself, Patterns of Evidence, is a unique title. And what that really is telling, what I'm trying to tell an audience is that it's a scientific approach. And I'm using a scientific approach to explore the historical events of the Bible. And for me, I grew up, in a Christian home. My mother read the Bible to us. I actually grew up in a single parent home, and I went to church faithfully, with her. And I was the oldest in the family. So I never really questioned the stories of the Bible, but it's not until you get older, when you leave your house and you go on to meet other people, that people start questioning it. And I eventually became a filmmaker and really moved into the area of documentary filmmaking. And I was very fascinated by the Bible and history. And so when someone invited me to go and search for evidence of the Exodus, it was an adventure. I was 42 at the time, and I ended up going into Egypt. In fact, it was just after 9/11, and I went searching with a film crew for the route of the Exodus. So this was almost over 18 years ago. I began making the film that we're going to be we're going to be releasing. So it's taken me this long to come to a place where I could be prepared to actually release the film.
Well, that's great. I've been working on projects for many, many years, probably as long as you have, and so I really can appreciate like the passion and the investment of just your energy and your soul into it. And I watched the video just now that's coming out. I got a special preview, and I really like the movie. Go see it, February 18th. It's in 800 theaters, but only for one night. Where do people get tickets for this movie? And this is called The Patterns of Evidence, and the subtitle is of this
The Red Sea Miracle.
The Red Sea Miracle. Yeah.
In fact, this is part 1. It's 18 years we've filmed a lot. We have a really big investigation. And in fact, I was told this is probably it's never been done before, where you have a film where you see the first part and of the film, and then you're going to come back, be able to absorb it, and then come back on May 5th is going to be the second part.
Oh, wow.
But yes, we've been working on it for a long time.
So where can people get tickets for this? It's only one night.
Yeah, patternsofevidence.com. If they go to patternsofevidence.com, they're going to be able to see a trailer, and they can purchase tickets. There's other information about the film. But in fact, I think I've got some clips that I brought for you too.
Yeah, I want to show the first clip here. The first clip is really an introductory clip, which at least for me, it set the stage. I saw that clip, and then I watched the whole hour and 40 approximately minute movie. So guys, here is a clip from Patterns of Evidence, the Red Sea Miracle.
Yep.
This story of the Exodus Sea crossing is where it all began for me over 18 years ago. I can't explain exactly why I've been so taken with this account, that I would risk my own business and personal life to explore these questions. I just knew it was something I had to pursue. And after all those years, I did find a pattern of evidence showing that the Exodus and conquest happened, and that Moses really could have written about these events as an eyewitness account. However, there are still major questions about where the Israelites traveled, what sea they crossed, and where Mount Sinai really is. In fact, after Israel gained control of the Sinai Peninsula in 1967, they searched extensively for evidence of their history. But no trace of the Exodus journey was found at the traditional locations. But have we been looking in the right places? If we can determine which sea was crossed, it could give clues about where to look for Mount Sinai. So now for me, the first issue in the Exodus journey is the Red Sea miracle. What sea was really parted, and could there still be evidence?
Wow, that's some great stuff you got there, Tim. I'm really excited for people. You know, I watched it just now, just spent about 2 hours nearly watching it, and I'm excited for people to have that opportunity. I love that you're laying out all this evidence. You know, I see a lot of videos where it's either people coming from a perspective of faith and they're just steamrolling any of the objections. They're not even hearing the objections. They're pretending they don't exist. And or they're not giving them air, let's put it that way. And then on the flip side, you have people who are coming from the academic world, and it's just a given that none of these things happen because miracles aren't real, God isn't real. We should, you know, the approach they'll take, that's not what I believe, but the approach that they'll take is they want to study the Exodus story the same way they would study biology, right? And so in biology, we're not expecting any supernatural events. We're expecting every time we perform an experiment, we'll have more or less the same results. And if we don't, maybe we did the experiment wrong. Well, here we can't experiment. It's history, so it's a bit different. Talk to me a little bit about that, because that was one of the themes for me throughout this movie, was the tension between naturalism and a miracle approach to history, a history that involves miracles.
Yes, exactly.
And actually, before you jump into that, I do this. I cut people off. I'm reminded of there's this famous interview where Dawkins was asked if he could believe that God was behind the creation of the universe or life, and he said absolutely not. And then they asked him, what about aliens? And aliens he considered a feasible possibility. Right? He didn't say he accepted it or didn't because he didn't have evidence, but he considered it a possibility, whereas God was not a possibility. And sometimes when I hear these discussions about the Exodus and about biblical history in general, I feel like I'm talking to Dawkins. So tell me how you talked about that tension that you have in the movie.
When I work on a film, I try to gather as much context as I possibly can, and in order for me to understand what the subject matter is. And our films are built on logic. Actually, so there's what you have is a history of, you start with the Bible, and the biblical text tells you a pattern. If you look for it, you can identify certain things. And what it is, as you saw in the film, there's a departure point. The Exodus has a departure point. Where did they leave from? Is there any evidence that they left from there? And it has a direction. Moses was leading them back to Mount Sinai. So there's a direction. Which way was that? Northwest, east, south? Which direction? Then there is a desert. And the question would be, what desert did they cross? And then there is a detour to a dead end, which we call, the trapping at a deep sea. That's number 5. And then there's a destination, Mount Sinai. So we're looking at, in this first part, we're looking at the first 3 elements of the first 3 parts of the sequence, a departure point, a direction, and a desert. And then we get to some of the turning points. And what I've shown in this film is there are 2 camps. There are 2 different camps of belief that I've sort of simplified it, and there's some crossover. The one camp I call the Egyptian camp, and that is the camp that basically is looking at, it's the last several hundred years, and it has to do with more of a naturalistic way of looking at the stories of the Bible, the narrative of the Bible. They're basically saying that the Bible borrowed or took words from Egyptian And some of those words are clues to where the sea crossing was, near Egypt, on the border lake of Egypt. And then the other group is called the Hebrew group, which I'm for sure you're quite familiar with it. And it all surrounds with around one major word, Yam Suf. Yam, it's a Hebrew word, Yam, sea, and Suf. The question is what does that mean?
Hold on.
People in the
Yeah.
Hebrew. Go ahead.
Let's hold off on the meaning of Yamsuf because I do want to dive into that.
Okay.
But you mentioned this that the Egyptian approach takes words from Egyptian, but I kept saying words from Hebrew or Semitic languages like Migdol, right? Pi Hachirot, which they interpret as an Akkadian word, which is a Semitic language. We have all these Baal Tzafon, two Hebrew words or two Semitic words for sure, not Egyptian words. So I do think that's really interesting that and you're right, like this is in a sense is an Egyptian approach, but they're trying to locate all these Egyptian places or all these Semitic names in Egypt itself, which seems kind of interesting to me. Wouldn't those be closer to the land of Israel, where Semites lived rather than in Egypt?
Yes, and so this is an issue of interpretation, and I'm sure you're quite familiar with two people can look at something. Well, actually, don't they say if there are two rabbis that look at something, they have three opinions?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Maybe
Well,
four.
and where that comes from is like that sounds like a joke, right? But it's not really a joke. If you look in the Talmud, the Jewish way of or traditional Jewish way of thinking and looking at a matter is they'll take, let's say, a verse in the Bible, and two rabbis will interpret it, and then 3 or 4 more rabbis will come along and they'll dissect what did the one rabbi mean. Is it really different than what the second rabbi meant? And they'll say, well, no, they were talking about 2 different scenarios. It's not that they had 2 different opinions. Oh no, they had 2 different opinions, and it'll give like 20 different. It'll have what's called a hava amina, which means I might think or I might say, and it'll bring more than 3 or 4 different interpretations, and
Yes.
they're just hashing it out. And in the end, sometimes they say, well, we don't know which of these are right. These are all the different possibilities, and that is one of the things I like about your films, that you seem to be doing that, is presenting the evidence.
Well, I think it is. I'm actually making films with a Hebrew approach because our films are raise questions.
Yeah.
They ask questions. And by the way, our film company is called Thinking Man Films.
I like it. Yeah. So, and that is interesting because in a way, the Greek approach is, and I don't know enough about the Egyptian approach to say, but the Greek approach is definitely very binary. And I think the Hebrew approach is, okay, these are the different possibilities. We don't know which of one is correct. Maybe more than one is correct under different circumstances and with different situations. All right, now I want to jump into the whole issue of I identified 4 different routes that you talked about, and maybe there were more in the route of the Exodus. And you made a statement that I think is interesting. You said the majority of scholars say that this one particular northern route is the most accepted by most scholars. I could tell you my experience at Hebrew University, in the Bible department at least, and in the archaeology department. Most scholars don't think the Exodus actually happened. They think it's a legend that was made up hundreds of years later or 1,000 years later. There might be some who say it happened, but it wasn't exactly what we think. And you bring a form of that, that it was 600 families or clans instead of 600,000 men, along with their wives and children, like it says in the Torah. So I think that's interesting that we have these different possibilities. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the reason why that they've come to those conclusions is partially the fact that there's a time period. So I heard this from there's a time period. So what they're going to say is the 1250 BC is when, or around that time period, is when an Exodus would have happened. So what they're saying is the Exodus that did not happen had to have happened at 1250 BC.
And you actually go into that in a little bit more depth in a previous conversation we had, and we'll put a link to that at nehemiaswall.com. Yeah, that's a good point. In other words, it would be like saying, we look through all the American sources in the year 1900, and we could find no evidence of the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. Well, because it didn't happen in 1900, it happened in 1776.
Yes.
Right. So that's a very good point. When I studied archaeology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, one of the things they taught us, this was in the early 90s, and they had just a little bit over a decade before, had finished the Israeli survey of the Sinai.
Yes.
And what they did is they knew we were making a peace treaty with Egypt, and we would have to give the Sinai back to Egypt. So they scoured the Sinai looking for archaeology. Number one, because we have the best archaeologists in the world. And number two is the Egyptians didn't seem really interested in it. They hadn't done this before. One of the little secrets about this is that Israel wasn't just looking for the archaeology, they were looking for any strategic advantage. So you brought up an interesting thing about how one of the routes had sand on it, and the other, and then this other route was more traversable because it wasn't like Sahara sand. So there's this incident in Israeli history that in 1956 we captured the Sinai, and then after a year later we gave it back to the Egyptians. But during that year we did a thorough land survey, and we found tracks that the Egyptians didn't know about, probably don't know about to this day, that our vehicles could go over, so that if we ever had to come back to Sinai, we would know the quickest route. We wouldn't get stuck in the sand. And these are even within more or less the same region. You go 10 feet in that direction or 30 feet in that direction, and you have routes that you can drive a car over, drive a tank over, march soldiers over. So we had mapped out in great detail every square centimeter of the Sinai, so that if there ever was another war, we would know exactly where to go and what to do. And we had another war, the 6-Day War, and then the Yom Kippur War, and that information proved really life-saving to the state of Israel. So during that entire process, we also looked for any archaeological remains. And I remember one of my professors at Hebrew University in the early 90s in archaeology saying, he said, if there was 2-3 million Israelites in the desert, it leaves a lot of archaeology. Where's all the archaeological remains? They're wandering around for 40 years in this triangle known as the Sinai Desert. Where's all the archaeology, right? I mean, you can go to Qumran, well, maybe not today, but a few decades ago, you could go to Qumran in the Judean desert, and there was an archaeologist who found the toilets at Qumran by smelling them after 2,000 years. Now, Qumran was a small community of, 50 or 100, 200 people. This was 2 to 3 million people. Let's say it was 600 clans. You're going to at the very least find their toilets, find all kinds of remains. And so this professor at Hebrew University said, it didn't happen because we looked in the Sinai and we didn't find it. So, and I feel like your movie is a response to what my professor said, or at least it's a way of offering an alternative explanation, even though you never met my professor, as far as I know, and but I'm sure you heard similar things from people.
Oh yeah, exactly. And so what I found is that many of these archaeologists have a preset, conditioned idea of the way they were taught. So what's happening is that one professor is teaching. They're basically locking in a time period and a location. So one of the phrases we've had is, have they been looking in the right places and in the right time periods? And so if you come with a preset existing set of ideals about the biblical narrative because of somebody 50 or 60 or 100 years ago that ironed that into the school of thought that was at the university, everyone's going to have a paradigm. In my films, I've talked about paradigms. Paradigms blind people from the possibility that what they were taught might not be the way it really was. And so I'm going to suggest, and we're going to continue to open up. We'll let people suggest and defend the idea that there is a possibility that the Israelites were in the Sinai. But there are other people, and this film is going to explore that the Israelites didn't. They crossed the Sinai because the ancient land of Midian is in northwest Saudi Arabia and southern Jordan. So it's very possible, very likely.
Hey, can we show that clip? We have a clip that talks about this.
Okay.
This talks about the location and shows a great map. Here is a clip about the location of the land of Midian.
When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, where for 40 years he tended sheep. And then one day God revealed himself to Moses and spoke to him out of a burning bush. God told Moses to return to Egypt and tell Pharaoh, to release the Israelite slaves and bring them back to this mountain that he was standing on to worship God.
This gives us a clue to the direction step. The initial destination of the Exodus journey was not the promised land, but rather a mountain where Moses encountered God during his 40-year stay in the land of Midian prior to the Exodus. The traditional view is that Moses encountered the burning bush at a mountain in the Sinai Peninsula. But was this the land of Midian?
One of the questions that people have always asked is that if you look at the biblical story of the Exodus, you see that Moses went to the land of Midian. All right, now the land of Midian, where is Midian? Midian is actually in Saudi Arabia. It's not in Sinai. It's not in what is today Transjordan, and it's not in Israel or Palestine. It's in Saudi Arabia.
Okay, so if you're looking for Midian in southern, what's called Sinai, what's the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt, and that's not the actual land of Midian, then you're not going to find it there, right? I mean, it'd be like going to Beersheba and saying, I didn't find any proof of David's capital in Jerusalem. Well, you didn't look in Jerusalem. Why would you find any proof? You know?
Yeah. If we go back to this issue of logic, I mean, once you start to look at this, and you realize oftentimes that there are really smart people, but some that have been sort of researching this, but they haven't asked the logical question.
Yeah,
I'm a visual person, as you can see. The films are visual.
Yeah,
and if I just sort of play out the logic of what some of these ideas that have been presented to us about the way the Bible is and why they can't find evidence for it, I don't necessarily see the logic in their reasoning. And I'm just trying to come up with, if I'm going to be a person of faith, I'm going to say, and if you're going to try to tell me that it didn't happen, I'd rather have a more compelling argument. And that's the reason why I made these films, is I have a calling, I guess, just like a number of people and yourself, you have a calling. You feel like you're supposed to do something. I didn't know I was supposed to be working on these films, but then if I was going to work on them, I figured out, well, what is the Bible saying? That's then what's the pattern that we would look for, and what's the context and the historical context that I would look for. And that's how I made these films. And what you uncover then is, wow, there's some real holes when people attack biblical historicity. There are some holes in their arguments.
Well, they kind of set up this impossible dilemma. In other words, or it's really a false dilemma. They set up this situation. They say, look, there's no, we're scholars, we're scientists, we can't deal with miracles. And I think that's okay, right? Meaning, that I think there's value in approaching the text with that approach, but it's not the only approach. So they'll say, okay, well, we can't deal with miracles, and therefore you could never prove that the Exodus happened, but we can prove it didn't. Well, wait a minute. That's kind of not a fair, that's not balance there, right? No, they're saying that there's only one thing we can prove. The other thing, by definition, we can't prove because it's a miracle, right? We could say it was aliens, but we couldn't say it was a divine being. That's the approach of science, and look, there is some validity, I think, to that approach, right? In other words, if I'm carrying out scientific experiments with chemicals, and I mix two chemicals, and there's two possible ways of explaining that. One is that there were spirits that were communicating with each other, and one was a more powerful spirit. And the other is, well, no, chemicals are made that way, and they have, valence bonds, and, I'm not a chemistry guy, right? But there's a naturalistic approach. I mean, look, I'm in favor of that in chemistry. Not that long ago, there was the demon theory of disease, that they didn't know about microorganisms, and there were three main theories of disease: demons, dirty air, and microorganisms, right? They said animals that are so small we can't see them, right? Well, you haven't proven it. Nobody's ever seen that animal. Okay, until Louis Pasteur was able to see him, right? So I kind of feel like there's a place for that in science. At the same time, when they enter into the study of the Bible and they say this is the only way to do it, and look, you had a gentleman at the end who I think was probably the most honest I've heard in a long time from academics. He said, if you say certain things, you're not going to get published, right? So there's certain things how the game is, right? And the people who don't know how the game is played, they don't end up as tenured professors, right? So it's what's called a self-selecting group. Any thoughts
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah. Well, and what you're referring to is that this big question about where if evidence is leading in a particular direction,
Mm-hmm.
but the academy or the university is saying that that's forbidden. You have to determine: am I willing to risk my career? In this particular case, a lot of these people who had a biblical understanding and they believe the Bible was telling them this was the location or this was the place. And we're talking about Midian. We're talking about where Mount Sinai might be.
Right.
Because when you cross a body of water, you're on your way then to the mountain where God had called Moses. And it's almost as if in this journey, as we look at it, that the body of water was part of God's gaining glory. In fact, it says that God, like 3 times in Exodus, it says, I'm going to gain glory over Pharaoh and his army. And that's what we're talking about. 3,500 years later, we're making, the 10 Commandments was about that event. I'm making a film. I've spent years doing it. God is going to gain glory because what happened a long time ago, he's saying it was true. And nations from that point on were fearful because of this God.
Well, that's a great point. There's this wonderful account in the book of Joshua where Joshua, he doesn't have the confidence in God that God is going to deliver the Canaanites into the hands of the Israelites. So he sends spies over, and the spies meet this woman, Rachav, and they ask her, what do you guys know? What do you Canaanites know about us? And she said, well, we've heard that your God split the sea and defeated Pharaoh. Right now, this is 40 years later. And one of the first things that comes to mind when you think about an Israelite is, how are we going to beat these guys? They defeated the Egyptians. They, the sea was split. It's interesting. You're dealing with this issue here, which is a relatively modern question. That did the Exodus happen at all? And I think of Josephus, who you mentioned in your video. So he wrote a book called Against Apion. Apion was this Jew hater in the Roman Empire. He was what we would call today an anti-Semite. And he said, okay, yeah, the Jews came out of Egypt because they were lepers. And the Egyptians threw them out of Egypt because they were full of diseases. And but the idea that an entire nation would make up a story that they had come out of Egypt and they had been slaves in Egypt, nobody in the ancient world would make up a story like that. Right? It's what they call the argument of embarrassment. Right? If you make up a story, you make up the story that you have some glorious past. You defeated some major empire, right? That you were slaves and you were your children were today we glorify being a victim. We're living in this era today in 2020 where where victimhood is glorified. It's everybody's trying to find how I'm a victim, so you get like this, it's like the oppression Olympics. But in the ancient world, to say that you had been slaves was not something you would brag about. That would be something very embarrassing. And the fact that the entire nation with one voice said, yeah, we were slaves in Egypt and God took us out. Okay, now a scientist could say, I can't prove whether Apion is right, that they were lepers and driven out of Egypt, or whether the Torah is right and God took them out of Egypt. But the fact that they went out of Egypt is testified by the entire nation. And, it doesn't seem to me like if somebody made that up, I think there would be some Jew somewhere who would call them out and say, wait a minute, my ancestor didn't know this story. And we actually have a statement similar to that in Deuteronomy, where it says, where in all of history, I'm paraphrasing, do you have a situation where God has taken a nation to be his? And it's in Deuteronomy after the Exodus, and he took them and revealed himself. We don't have any account like that. It really is a unique event in history, the revelation at Sinai, which I think you're going to get to in a future video, future film. So remind the people one more time where they can see this movie.
Okay, Patterns of Evidence, the Red Sea Miracle is going to be, you can see a trailer at patternsofevidence.com and buy tickets there. And we are in 800 theaters for only one night. Only one night, which is February 18th. It's in 800 theaters. It's a one night only event. But these films, as you know, these films are events. So there's a pre-show, but it starts right on time. And the time set for this is like 7 p.m. There'll be an intermission, a 12-minute intermission. Then we'll have part 2. Because, my films are, there's a lot of information. But they're dramatic. they turn. They've got recreations. We've got a lot going on in them. And then at the end of the film, there's going to be about an 18-minute panel discussion to sort of wrap it up, and so really understand what's at stake here.
Very cool. Hey, can we just talk real quick about the phrase Red Sea? Because you have some great discussions about this. Something as simple as the phrase Red Sea is subject to so many different interpretations. Some of them probably more valid than others. Talk to us a little bit about this term that we take for granted, how it's not that clear what it means, or at least there's a lot of different opinions and scholarship about what it means.
Right. So it goes back to Hebrew, right? I mean, when Moses was writing, he wrote Yam Suf. Yam meaning sea. The question is what is Suf? And one of the things that we do know, and that I've learned about, is that the Hebrew group is going to say every time this Hebrew word Yam Suf is used, when it's used to identify the geographical location, it's always associated with the Gulf of Aqaba. When Moses is writing and God tells him what the boundary of Israel is, it's Yam Suf, and that's the Gulf of Aqaba. It's the southern border of Israel. And then when Hezekiah and King Solomon are referencing it, they had a fleet of ships on Yam Suf. So
can I read that verse? So it's 1 Kings 9:26. And King Solomon made a fleet at Etzion Gever, which is near Elot. And today we call it, in the Bible it actually says Elot, but today that's referred to as Elot. On the edge of the sea of the Yam Suf in the land of Edom, in the land of Edom. So that's interesting. So there's no question whatsoever. This couldn't be something that today is in roughly the area of the Suez Canal. In other words, we have the two branches of the Red Sea, the Gulf of, I might be backwards for the audience, but one of them is, the one on the left is the Gulf of Suez, and the other you referred to in the movie as the Gulf of Aqaba. In Israel, we call it Mifrat Eilat, the Gulf of Eilat. It's like the two branches that go like this of the Red Sea, and in between them is the supposed Sinai Peninsula, or the so-called Sinai Peninsula. So a lot of your video, a lot of your movie is dealing with this question of which of these two branches, and is it even the sea itself, or is it some other body of water? And boy, guys, there's a lot of information there. You really lay out a lot of different opinions. You bring top experts, that's very impressive that you got these people to come on camera. You mentioned in the movie that you have people who said that if this is what you're talking about, we don't want to come on camera. How often did you get that response?
Oh, it happens. It has happened depending upon what sacred cow I'm going to be talking about.
Okay.
Whether it's the chronology or whether it's issues of where the sea crossing was. There's a lot of resistance to a Gulf of Aqaba because of the people have been looking for chariot wheels. Well, we're going to take on that in the second film, the whole chariot wheel question. And we've had divers that have been filming, and I've been collecting the footage for a long time. And so we're going to be looking at, in this big investigation, this is an epic documentary. You can see that, can't you?
Yeah. Well, it's epic in the sense that it's episodic, right? You're now three movies in, and how many more do you have to go?
Well, I shouldn't tell you this, but we've outlined about 50 hours.
Okay.
Honestly,
I won't tell anybody. It's just between me and you and the audience.
Okay.
And the audience.
So we've got, I've got about enough footage in the can for another 5 or 6 films already.
Wow.
And so there's so much to tell, and there's so much. We have thousands of hours of investigative footage, and we're just weaving it together because it has to be made into something. So, but I think that the investigation is going to allow people, it's going to be inspiring, but it's also going to allow people to say, well, what does this mean for me today? Because in this film, I also make it personal. In other words, if God was able to provide for these people and take them to this distance, that's the question. Is God showing us that in impossible situations, and with more people than you think would be possible, this is the battle between a natural way of looking at it and saying, well, and a supernatural way of looking at it. And I think at the end of the day, that's the big question that we're raising.
I think that last statement that you just made is probably the number one thing that makes a lot of people in the academic world say, whoa, 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 whatever we do, it's almost like it quacks like a duck, and it talks like a duck, and it walks like a duck, and it looks like a duck, but we can't say it's a duck, because if we say it's a duck, if we say that there's some supernatural event, then somebody will come along and they'll derive some spiritual application to it. And it seems like there's this fear there in the academic world, like, oh no, we don't want these, religious fanatics who actually believe these books to come along and derive. I mean, exactly what you just said, right? I mean, if God could bring the Israelites through the desert and feed them and nourish them, surely he can take care of me.
Right. And my family, and, growing up in a single parent home, there were times when, God provided for our family, and I came to just have a faith that would happen. And, we basically talk about truth. And you said something, I never thought about this before, like a religious fanatic, but we have academic fanatics.
Absolutely. Well, I brought the example of Dawkins.
Yeah.
Who's willing to entertain that it's aliens, but not a divine being.
Right. So an academic is basically not willing to go sometimes where the evidence is pointing, or they can't arrive there because they're living by a code. And the question then at the end of the day is has God acted in history? And can we find a pattern? And patterns of evidence is taking a scientific approach and basically looking for the events and saying, well, what if it surfaces? And we do see a pattern of evidence that matches the biblical text. And we're seeing that in many cases. But what happens is that for people to acknowledge that God might actually have been involved in this and miracles are happening, that is a challenge for a number of people. But I'm comfortable with that because it's starting to, our films basically, I'm not going to tell you what to think, but I've had people who didn't believe said, you know what, I don't have as much confidence in my unbelief anymore.
Wow. It's not just that they're living by a code, some of these fanatics, and I guess I'm talking about the academic fanatics. It's not just they're living by a code, they're part of a culture. I had this conversation a few weeks ago. I was at my sister's house near Ma'ale Adumim in Israel, and she's a scientist, and works in a lab, runs the lab, and we were talking about a very controversial issue that I'm not going to even say what it is because it doesn't matter, but it was a very controversial issue within the scientific world. She would say, no, every scientist knows that this isn't true. And I'm like, okay, well, there seems to be, it's like, okay, you bring a number like 92%, there's 8% that say something. And her position was, well, how can all the scientists be wrong? Somebody would have called this out. And I said, well, wait a minute. You're telling me that if there's some low-level scientist at some small little school in Nebraska, and they apply to the National Institute of Health, and their hypothesis is contrary to the accepted opinion, that grant request will be accepted and they're going to get funding. And she said, well, I guess in theory it's purely objective, but in reality you're right. If they propose something, and here we're just talking about raw science, right? We're talking about meaning the so-called natural sciences, not the humanities, where you can actually prove things with experimentation. So if somebody proposes an experiment to prove something that's considered heretical, and there's actually a thing today called the Heterodox Academy of scholars who say, wait a minute, we should be allowed to ask these questions. We should be allowed to, I won't even say what the issues are, but we should be, you could think off the top of your head of a few issues that most people, I think, can, that, wait a minute, if you brought that up in a scientific context, you'd be laughed out of the academy. Well, but what if you're right? There's this great quote, and I've brought it a number of times for my listeners. It's from the British ambassador, the English ambassador to Venice. In 1611, he writes to the King James I, and he gives him a report about how there's this mathematician who looked through this tube and claims these crazy things, that there are canyons and mountains on the moon, which is completely contrary to 2,000 years of science. And he's talking about Galileo. And he ends the letter and he says, the man will prove to be exceedingly famous or exceedingly ridiculous. Meaning in 1611, when he's giving this report, he doesn't know whether Galileo is going to be the laughing stock of the scientific world or one of the greatest scientists of history. And he says, I'm sending one of these devices so you can look for yourself. Meaning he's like, I know this sounds crazy. And he starts off the letter saying, this is the most fantastical report I've ever submitted. Look for yourself through this tube, through this telescope, and you'll see if it's real. And I love what you're doing is you're presenting the people with the evidence. They can look for themselves. They can decide if they agree or disagree, or which of the options they agree or disagree with.
Yeah. I was thinking about the name Copernicus too.
Yeah. So Copernicus didn't prove it. Copernicus hypothesized that the sun was in the center of the solar system, the earth went around it. Galileo actually proved, he at least definitively proved, that there were bodies that went around other bodies that weren't the earth, right? Because he could see the 4 moons going around, they're called the Galilean moons today, the 4 moons that he identified going around Jupiter, and he proved definitively, it wasn't a theory anymore, not everything goes around the earth. 4 moons, or he thought they were planets, go around Jupiter. So Copernicus, think about that. He was out in the wilderness making this hypothesis, and for decades, nobody knew for sure if he was right. And even Galileo, the beauty of Galileo's observation is it was empirical. You didn't have to take his word for it. You could look through the telescope yourself. And it wasn't like some super collider. It was something that at least the king could afford, right? Maybe not the average person.
I had a situation one time. Sometimes in your subconscious, there are ideas you don't know where they come from, but I was trying to measure some property that we had. We were camping property, and people couldn't figure out, because there were hills and valleys and there were trees and brush, and it was hard to basically get a straight property line to put and people were putting their driveways in and crossing over other people's problem. For some reason, when we were trying to figure this out, I said, well, what if I said, yeah, can you imagine how difficult this would be? But what, if you did it in the dark?
Yeah.
And I don't know why I said it.
Yeah.
And I thought about it. I go, why don't we do this in the dark?
Wow. Were you able to do it?
What we did is I remember that when we were camping, I could see a lantern for a long ways away.
Yeah.
And so what we did is we stuck a lantern on the end of, or a great big light on the end of the property line, and another one on the other end. And we had a flashlight, and we could basically align.
Oh, wow.
If someone walked a little bit off, we could see, and we could look back, and you could just walk straight to that light. That little beam of light would work through the trees and branches and everything. Wow. And you could and we marked the property lines in total darkness with light.
That's pretty cool.
Now, I don't know how I came up with that idea,
That's
but
cool.
that it worked. And, but I think about some of the way these films are being made. There's a sense of intuition. There are times when I feel like I personally feel like I'm being guided to information, and these films are, once again, the Red Sea Miracle. I had a sense that it really was so big that we needed to make it into 2 parts. So the first one is February 18th, and this is a film that you can bring anybody, wouldn't you say? Because if someone doesn't believe, they're not going to be offended. They're going to basically have a lot to think about. This is a historical, archaeological investigation, but it's inspiring too.
I think if you bring someone who's, let's say, an atheist or is primed not to believe this, they'll say, okay, well, at least my side was represented, right? We had the Austrian guy who says, no, this is ridiculous. This would be a difficult thing to conclude, basically, right?
Yeah.
So I like that. We live in an age today where people are in their little bubbles and they don't hear what the opposite side has to say. Somebody did a study recently, and and I won't even say which side it was, but there were 2 groups in America. One of them could predict what their views would be, and the other side, which is supposed to be the open-minded side, could not predict at all what the other side was going to be. There was like, well, they're just bad people, right? They don't have a view. There is no view. They're just bad people. They're just full of hate. Well, really, they don't have a view, and they do, right? Hey, I want to just jump really quickly into this whole thing of the Red Sea. I'm going to jump into the Red Sea. So, it's interesting. You brought up something I hadn't really thought a lot about, how the Greek translators translated it. So I did a little bit of digging, and I found that, so the phrase there is erythro thalassa, which is literally Red Sea. And Herodotus, the Greek historian, uses that term. And he writes now in Arabia, not far from Egypt, there is a gulf extending inland from the sea called Red. The Arabian Gulf of which I shall speak extends from the south towards Syria. So he describes this Arabian Gulf, meaning it's a gulf that runs along the coast of Arabia, and it comes in from the Red Sea. And there he's talking about the Red Sea. He's including the Indian Ocean, as well as the Persian Gulf.
Right.
So he basically is describing the Gulf of Aqaba or the Gulf of Eilat. Sounds to me at least like.
Yeah.
Now, he might not have known there were two different seas there, right? That's possible. And you bring that up.
So what you're suggesting is that there's a crossing in these border lakes right here. How did you come up with that?
Well, it all began by my interest in this very famous depiction on the walls of Karnak Temple, which show the Pharaoh Seti I, who was the father of Ramses II. And what we have here is a 3,300-year-old road map containing the forts from Egypt's frontier, depictions of forts and their names stretching across northern Sinai all the way to the land of Canaan. This shows us water. We have pictures of lakes. We have pictures of reeds growing out here, but all of this is desert today.
The reeds depicted on the Karnak inscription connect well with the popular Sea of Reeds definition for Yam Suf.
Well, I think what we're saying is that the Gulf, there's a Gulf of the Red Sea called Aqaba, and then there's a Gulf of the Red Sea called Suez. They extend like rabbit ears, as it were. And so the question of Red Sea, because later on we hear the word Sea of Reeds. And now what I understand is that the Greeks, if it was called a reedy sea, the Greeks actually had about 20 different words for vegetation that they could have used. They could have called it Sea of Reeds, but they didn't. They called it the Red Sea.
Yeah.
So there's a clue that they realized that this wasn't just a shallow lake, 3 to 6 or 7 feet deep on Egypt's border, that this was actually a sea. And that's the reason why the Septuagint, when it was translated, went from Yam Suf to Red Sea. And so that's something to think about.
So I have a hypothesis here that I'm just throwing out, and I don't, it requires further investigation. But I read you that verse from 1 Kings 9:26, and it referred to the Yam Suf in the land of Edom. Edom means red. So it's very possible that when they said Red Sea, that let's say the translators of the Septuagint, who were these Jewish rabbis in Alexandria, that they were saying, the sea, the Idumean Sea, that is the sea of the land of red. Right?
Of Edom.
So
or Edom.
Edom, or so it's possible. I don't know. And it was a term that already existed. That's for sure. Meaning it existed in the context of Herodotus referring to the sea. He actually talks there, Herodotus, how he thinks there was another sea that got filled in by the by the Nile. And it just goes to show what a limited knowledge of geography they had back then. We take it for granted that we can pull up Google Maps and that everybody, surely if he's in Egypt, he would know. I wouldn't assume that at all, right? He might not know what's down the road. So, guys, this is a really good movie. I want to invite you to come see it. Give the people one last time the dates and where they can get the tickets.
Yeah. Patterns of Evidence, the Red Sea Miracle. If you go to our patternsofevidence.com, patternsofevidence.com, they can go, if they see the trailer, they can buy tickets there. And I encourage people to buy tickets, where ticket sales are growing really, really well. We can sell out in certain areas. In fact, I know we've got some theaters that are selling, they're trying to put more showings, but it's only a one-night event, basically. And it's going to be a full evening. It starts at 7 p.m. It's sharp. I mean, the movie starts right at that time. There'll be an intermission in the middle, and then there'll be a panel discussion at the end of it. And I think that they're going to have, if you've ever heard of the Patterns of Evidence films, what you're going to know, these are 5-star award-winning films, and they're big theatrical productions. You're going to meet a lot of people. There's probably a cast of about 24 or so, I don't know, over 20 cast members as far as experts that are going to be talking. And they're following my personal journey. This is my story that's taken me almost 20 years to get to this point, to bring all this information, evidence, and present it in a multi-viewpoint case. And then we're going to carry that on May 5th, and we're going to have the conclusion of the Red Sea miracle. We're going to go into the diving, the chariot wheels, or what are people finding.
So the chariot wheels will be in part 2 on May 5th. Okay.
Yeah, that's great. And we're just going to get in the whole thing, because everybody has been a part of this investigation. I'm trying to basically historically give a context to what's happened, and then we're going to be dealing with miracles and the question of miracles. And does God violate the laws of nature? Can he intersect into his own creation? And does God act through time and history where he does interact? And that's we're going to have debate about that. And so there's a lot more in this big epic documentary. And it's really fun. And we've got some of Cecil B. DeMille in this as well.
Yeah.
As you know, I got to know the family, and they were a big supporter of this film.
Very cool. All right, guys, you heard it. February 18th, 2020. And we're going to post a link at nehemiaswall.com. Thank you for joining us. Any last words you want to share with the audience?
Well, I think that this film, I've heard some people say, and I know that your audience is probably, they believe in the biblical text and they want the Bible to be true. Our films.
Hey, you shouldn't assume anything about my audience. We've got people from all walks of life. We've got, really people who aren't Jewish, people who aren't Christian, from all over the world. So, I think there'll be a lot here for everybody.
I was going to say, our films work from the agnostic. Yeah. I've had some people say, I don't even know which way this is going. But I'm going to tell you that people of faith are going to be encouraged, because most of the time films are negative about the Bible. This particular film, in fact, my films come across sometimes and people say, you need to tell people that there are some positive, interesting things you're going to see about the evidence of the Bible. And so this isn't all just going to be like tearing it down. And but at the end of the day, it's going to be inspirational as well. That's what I'm trying to say.
All right. Thank you very much. Shalom.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye-bye.
You have been listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemia Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemia's McCore Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiaswall.com.